So, continuing with your lecture for blood vessels, we have discussed the categories and classification of arteries as elastic arteries, followed by muscular or distributing arteries, which branch farther into arterioles, and arterioles branch into meta-arterioles, and eventually into capillary beds. Now, when blood passes through the capillaries, as we mentioned, this is the location for the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So basically, if we're talking about the typical tissues of the body, you have oxygen that is moving from the capillary network, oxygen moving from the capillary network into the tissue that is surrounding the capillary network, and carbon dioxide is going to move into the capillary networks and basically return to the lungs and eventually exhaled out. Keeping that in mind, and keeping in mind what we know about the color of the red blood cells, as it's bounded to oxygen as oxyhemoglobin versus deoxyhemoglobin, when oxygen removed from your hemoglobin, we can see here that the first half connected to the arterioles is appear as red because it's going to be oxygen rich. And as you move farther in, oxygen goes to the tissue and carbon dioxide comes into the capillary network, and it changes color to blue. As we actually know, it's not technically blue, it's darker red shade, which appears to be blue because of the way that the light hits it. Now, when your blood vessels, when your capillaries are basically carrying the oxygenated blood, now it's going to take that blood, and the goal is to take that and return it back to the heart, and from heart you want to turn it to the lungs, where it will be basically allow for another gas exchange to take place and remove that carbon dioxide. So the first thing you need to understand about the system is we're talking about blood vessels returning to the heart, so we're talking about veins in general. The other thing you need to know is that blood pressure typically in veins are going to be much lower than arteries because you're basically getting farther and farther away from the heart, which acts as the pump. So as you move farther and farther away from them, basically you drop pressure more and more. Interesting fact that when blood actually goes back to the heart as deoxygenated blood through your veins, it actually reaches the heart with a 0 millimeter of mercury pressure. So we're starting from about 120 millimeter of mercury when your heart is pumping, all the way down to 0 by the time the blood comes back to the heart. And again, that's something interesting to remember. Now, when we're talking about capillaries and blood being picked up away from the capillaries, the first category of blood vessels you see are referred to as venules. So notice how capillaries are basically emptying into these smaller blood vessels that are referred to as venules. Structurally, it could be similar to arterial as a sense of arterioles goes to the capillaries and venules picks up from the capillaries. But the reality is that the diameter of these blood vessels are larger than arterioles, because we learned earlier on that veins typically have a larger lumen compared to arteries, and this is very clearly represented if you're comparing the diameter of arterioles, which are about 10 micrometers, to the diameters of venules, which are between 8 to 100 micrometers. As you can see, their venules are going to be definitely larger in diameter. Smaller venules that are basically coming off from the capillary network are called post-capillary venules, which basically directly pick up blood from the capillary networks. Now, as you can follow this, individual venules are going to join to each other to form a larger blood vessel, which we refer to them as veins. Interestingly, if we're comparing the histology of veins to arteries, you will notice that the tunica externa is the thickest tunic in veins compared to when we compare muscles. Typically, the tunica media is the largest among the three layers. So that would be considered one of the main differences. Now understand that veins, as I mentioned, are getting farther and farther away from the heart in the sense of when your heart pumps blood. So as you get farther away from the pump, your pressure is going to continuously drop until by the time you go back to the heart, your pressure is at 0. So how are we maintaining or the ability to take this blood through the piping, basically your veins, and return it back to the heart without having any pressure? One way we do that is using a structure referred to as valves. And you can see these valves right here as open valves and right here as closed valves. So the other thing that you have that gives you the ability to send blood back to the heart is surrounding the veins with your skeletal muscle. So let's take a look at the pictures we have here. So you see the vein moving blood up back toward the heart. So let's say this is a blood vessel that is coming from your leg. And you can see that the skeletal muscles are surrounding your vein. So what happens is as the skeletal muscle starts to contract, which you see right here, it squeezes the vein, okay? So think about you have a balloon full of water and you squeeze the center. What happens is blood or water that's in your balloon, some wants to go back down and some wants to go up because you're squeezing right in the middle. Now the reality is, even if blood wants to go downward, there are valves that are going to basically close up that prevents blood to backflow downward. So this is out. So the only option you remain is blood moving up. And as blood moves up, what does it do? It pushes the valves open, and again, it passes directly and upward against the gravity toward your heart. So again, if you squeeze these muscles, the valve on the bottom will be closed, the valve on the top would be open. And if we do the same thing with muscles on top, then this will be closed up and the valve farther up will be open, allowing the fluid motion in one direction only. Now, another cool fact that we need to know in a general sense for blood vessels is associated with blood vessels that are typically associated with your veins, I should say. It's a word called vascular anastomosis. So many of the blood vessels in your body is actually interconnected, which means you don't have one part of the body's blood being collected with only one vein. You actually have multiple blood vessels that collect from one region, creating redundancy in your system. Now, the other cool fact that you need to know is that redundancy is more frequent this anastomosis is more frequent in veins compared to arteries. And when you look at the blood vessels in 251, in a sense of anatomy and structure and terminology, you learn some of these vascular anastomosis in that lecture. Now we also have something called vasovasorum. So as we learn, the word vaso implies vessel. So vasovasorum means vessels of the vessels. Basically blood vessels within blood vessels. So if you remember this picture that I'm drawing here, this thick histological sample that we have, a representation of the elastic artery, because we can see the thickness of the elastin right in the middle, which is the only option we have would be elastic arteries. Now, think about the thickness of these blood vessels. It's very difficult to supply blood throughout this tissue, right? It's very thick. So what you do is you actually embed a specific blood vessels, which you see right here, right here, right here, through the tissue itself, through the blood vessel, through the thickness of the blood vessel, to supply oxygenated blood for these cells. So as it means, again, this is the blood vessel, this is the wall of a blood vessel, and within that you embed blood vessels to supply and make sure these cells are nurtured and receive enough oxygen. So that's what the word vasovasorum actually means. Now, we are going to be talking about blood vessels such as main branches of blood vessels associated with the heart. We're going to start with the largest of the blood vessels we have, which is called the aorta. Aorta is the largest branch that comes from a part of the heart called the left ventricle. So if you take your heart, and this is a really bad drawing of the heart. Heart has 4 chambers, okay? This is the right side, and this one on the top called right atrium. This one on the left-hand side called left atrium, so this is the left side. The 1 on the bottom is referred to as right ventricle, and this one would be left ventricle. So main blood vessel that's coming from this chamber, left ventricle, is called the ascending aorta. Is the one that is identified as the largest elastic artery, and it forms a smaller branches that basically spread through the heart, and it supplies the heart itself. So when it says coronary artery, the word coronary implies heart itself. So ascending aorta not only supplies all over the body and branches to form and supply the rest of the body, it also supplies the heart itself. Now, as you take the aorta, left ventricle, as you come off of the left ventricle, see I'm going up, I'm ascending. Then I'm gonna loop, and that loop that I'm forming is known as the aortic arch. And then I start to go behind the heart and come back down. So what am I doing? I'm descending. So ascending aorta, going up. Then I arch to form the aortic arch, and then I start to come down behind the heart to go down to the abdomen, the rest of the thoracic, your legs, to supply them with oxygen. You do that through the descending aorta. Now, coming off of the aortic arch, which is the top part, you have 3 blood vessels. If I start with the first one, coming off of the aortic arch, this one is referred to as brachiocephalic trunk. The second branch that comes off of the aortic arch is called left common carotid artery. And the third one that is coming off of the aortic arch is called left subclavian artery. As you start to go down, again, you're going into the thoracic cage, basically your rib cage. So we call that the thoracic aorta. And then what you pass through is your diaphragm, basically the dome-shaped muscle we have right here. If you pass below the diaphragm, then you get into the abdominal region where you have your intestines, your stomach, etc. So that part of the aorta is referred to as the abdominal aorta, which continue going down all the way until they reach your legs. So in legs, they are going to branch to form right for right leg and left common iliac artery, which is the branches that I'm representing right here and right here. And again, you do need to remember that these continue to branch until they reach arterial and then capillaries, and then eventually become venules and veins. So here's what I was trying to draw for you on the previous picture. This is coming from your left ventricle, becomes the ascending aorta. You see these 2 tiny branches coming off, which is your coronary artery supplying the heart, goes through the aortic arch, and as coming off of the aortic arch, the first branch is brachiocephalic, second branch is left common carotid, and the third branch is left subclavian artery. Aortic arch starts to come down, and as it comes down in the thoracic cavity is referred to as the thoracic aorta. You don't need to know the descending part, so I can just draw a line on it. What you see here is this is the muscle which we call the diaphragm. So anything below that would be the abdominal aorta, which branches to 2 main branches called the common iliac artery. Now, another concept we're going to talk about is blood pressure that can be maintained using your heart as a pump and also the blood vessels themselves. So, you do need to remember that your circulation of your blood is through a closed system, which means it starts from the heart and it ends at the heart. So blood vessels that are starting from the heart are starting from your heart, more specifically your left ventricle, and then circle through the body, lose their oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide, and then return back to the heart using your veins. So it's a closed system. Now, the other thing you need to understand is within this system, within the systemic blood pressure, I should say, we have basically maintaining ability to maintain blood pressure. Now, the highest blood pressure we have in our body is within the aorta, because aorta starts from the heart itself, from the pump itself. And the lowest is in the vena cava. So you should be asking, what the heck is a vena cava? So remember when we talk about veins? So veins are the ones that return blood back to the heart. And we actually have two largest veins that return blood back to the heart. One are called superior vena cava, which is from collecting blood from your neck, your arms, and your head. And then you have inferior vena cava, which collects blood basically from the lower part of below the heart, anything below the heart. So both of these blood vessels return blood back to the heart, and they will have the lowest blood pressure, which we decided to be 0 millimeter mm H, capitalize H, G. Now, if you look at the amount of resistance created in this blood pressure, arterioles, which are basically right before the capillary network, have the highest amount of resistance. So basically they don't expand or they don't change based on the flow of blood. And as a result, they have the sharpest drop in blood pressure. So sharpest drop in blood pressure, which we start with 120 millimeter of mercury. When it comes to the arteriole, you have the highest or the most significant drop in blood pressure. Let me show you this picture. So in this picture, what we're looking at is the pressure within the blood vessels in millimeter of mercury. And on the x-axis, basically the blood vessels we talked about. Aorta, which is the largest blood vessels. Arteries, which basically implies your muscular or distributing arteries. Arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, and vena cavas. So notice that we start about 120 millimeter of mercury, but then you see by the time we get to arterioles right here, do you see how you have this significant drop? So this significant drop is because your arterioles have the most resistance in them. So you will see basically it says, well, I mean, if you want to increase the blood pressure, I'm not letting you. So it causes the blood pressure to significantly drop. The other thing that you need to know is the flow of blood that happens, the velocity of blood in the blood vessels. It's not visible in the picture, but one thing that you do need to know, if we're looking at the velocity of blood, how fast blood passes through, the most significant drop takes place in capillaries, because what happens in capillaries is we have, what do we call? Exchange. Sorry, really bad handwriting. So exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide happens in capillaries. So if you move the blood really rapidly, would you be able to allow the exchange to take place? The answer is no. So what you do is you drop the velocity of blood really low, so your blood basically can exchange its nutrients and oxygen with the tissue, and then as it passes by the capillary network, then the velocity starts to pick up slightly. So arterial blood pressure depends on two facts, going back to what we were discussing earlier. Arterial blood pressure depends on how much the arteries can stretch, so basically how much elastic fibers you have, and how much blood is being forced through that artery. So the more blood you're pushing through, basically think about you have a pipe, the more water passing through the pipe, the higher the blood pressure is, or sorry, the higher the pressure is. Same thing with your blood vessels. The more blood passes through a blood vessels, the higher the pressure would be associated with that blood vessel. So before I end up this PowerPoint, I just want to clarify one point for you guys. We haven't really discussed heart yet, but I started to use the word systemic blood pressure here. So you should be asking, what is systemic blood pressure? So if you look at the word systemic, it implies systems or systems of the body or organ systems. So basically, when we're talking about systemic blood pressure, we're talking about blood that is circulating in the body to supply oxygen for the tissues. Okay, so I basically take oxygenated blood from the heart and I circulate it in the body, doesn't matter which part of the body, throughout the body, and give that oxygen away and pick up the carbon dioxide. And that blood is going to return back to the heart through the vena cavas. So systemic blood starts with aorta on the left side of the heart and ends with vena cavas, superior and inferior vena cava, and return back to the right side of the heart. You don't really need to be focusing much on it, but since the word is introduced here, I do want you guys to have a clear understanding of what is systemic blood pressure. To also introduce you to the second word is pulmonary blood circulation or circulation, which is, as the word pulmonary implies, is circulation of blood to your lungs or your respiratory system. This is where the blood, which is deoxygenated, high in carbon dioxide, actually goes to the lungs, where it drops its carbon dioxide and it picks up the oxygen and returns back to the heart. So in reality, if you look at your body, you have two circulation. Systemic circulation that supplies the body with oxygenated blood and picks up carbon dioxide, and pulmonary circulation that takes the deoxygenated blood from the heart, sends it to the lungs to be oxygenated and get back to the heart again. We will discuss this in much more detail when we start to look at heart anatomy in cardiovascular system. So I will be stopping here and we'll pick it up on your next PowerPoint.